Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney. Instances of far-left extremism are linked to psychopathic tendencies and narcissism, according to a new peer-reviewed quantitative study published in the journal Current Psychology. What's been obvious to all of us from the beginning can now be punctuated with the obnoxious leftist addendum of scientists say. Naturally, as post-millennial journalist Andy No points out on Twitter, radical left-wing movements often attract people suffering from mental health issues and encourage them to be violent, to act on it. For this reason, it's not surprising to researchers at the University of Bern in Switzerland found many far-left activists don't really support specific social causes and instead want to satisfy their own ego-related needs through a process known as the dark ego vehicle principle. This principle suggests violent forms of activism give individuals with dark personality traits such as narcissism opportunities to display their perceived sense of moral superiority over the rest of us. Political affiliation is still an important factor in who participates in left-wing protests. However, the study finds some participants will join leftist movements primarily to demonstrate their ability to force their beliefs on fellow citizens. Unfortunately, one can easily find real-world examples of dangerous criminals trying to force those around them to buy into left-wing ideologies here all over the West. For instance, a UK man named Clive Bundy, not to be confused with the freedom-loving ranchers from Nevada, because this Clive Bundy is a criminal sex offender who repeatedly raped his own daughter for 9 years during her childhood. Now he wants people to believe he's a woman. Bundy was arrested back in 2016 and was sentenced to 15 years in prison after police found images of child sexual abuse on his laptop. But he only served about half the sentence and was released a few weeks ago. Before he left prison, he changed his name to Claire Fox, which also happens to be the name of a prominent UK legislator in the House of Lords who argues the transgender movement threatens free speech. It's unclear if this was a personal dig at Fox, though it likely was, but this name change does allow him to hide behind the mainstream attention going to this UK Parliament official online. Of course, a problem arises because Bundy's old name is on the country's official sex offenders list. And as you'd imagine, the man's daughter, Sarah Lee, a 24-year-old woman with a young child of her own and who's trained to become a paramedic, wants the two names to be linked online out of fear for herself and for other potential victims. However, current UK law appears to show Claire Fox is almost considered to be a new person, giving this criminal the opportunity to hide his old ways and to assume a new life as a victim, no matter how shocking it is to his friends and family, none of whom believe him or expected a macho man like Bundy to change his identity. Now, Sarah Lee is working to ensure her father's gender transition won't put other women at risk, and she's already being criticized for her efforts by some activists who call her, yes, of course, transphobic. Therein lies the issue. No one's allowed to be critical of the secular West's new religion. Anyone who dares to challenge the leftist dogma must be shamed and deprogrammed from their current belief system in Mao-like struggle sessions. We see this happening right now in the U.S. on Major League Baseball fields of all places. According to a new article from The Federalist by David Harsanyi, a pitcher for the Toronto Blue Jays is apologizing for sharing a post on his social media profile that promoted boycotts against companies like Target and the owner of Bud Light. First, he said his actions hurt the Pride community. Then he said he's committed to better educating himself on such matters moving forward. But we all know education in this context really means ideological indoctrination. It really is sad to see a grown man broken like this to save his career. At least Dodgers relief pitcher Blake Trinan appears to be standing strong after having given this letter to a member of Turning Point USA to release to the public. In it, he explains his disappointment in his team honoring the drag troupe the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, saying that their work is blasphemous and openly displays hatred of Catholics and other Christians. He goes on to say that he understands that playing baseball is a privilege and not a right, but that his convictions in Jesus Christ will always come first. He then concludes with two verses, biblical verses, one from Galatians and the other from the book of Joshua, in which it says, "Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows, and that as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Joining us now to discuss all this and more is Ian Haworth, the host of Off Limits with Ian Haworth. Ian, thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks as always for having me.
Great. So do you think these MLB struggle sessions, because that's what they are because baseball is one of the last somewhat conservative sports left, whereas basketball and football have been on the woke train for a while now?
Yeah, I think this is just the latest sport to really fold to the woke agenda. You've got, if you actually look at most athletes, a lot of them are conservative because sport is a meritocracy. You can't exactly have affirmative action in sport. You're either good at it or you're not. And so a lot of athletes are actually conservative. A lot of people think they can speak out. They can privately. But I think a lot of the times, a lot of these athletes are realizing that they simply have to adhere to a woke agenda now. And unfortunately, MLB is one of the last sports to survive. I definitely celebrate the few players who are actually standing by their principles. But unfortunately, when you have a lot of money involved, some people will choose the money. It's really disheartening to see. I think if you're going to be quiet, that's one thing. We can have a debate over whether or not you should speak out. But to speak out and then undo it all by apologizing to these people, I think is too far for me.
It really is, and it only feeds the beast even more when you see, like you were saying earlier, someone who puts a statement out there saying they disagree with it, like the Toronto Blue Jays athlete, and then of course, like you said, then he walks it back. There's actually that image I'm thinking of in my mind where he's surrounded by a gaggle of reporters with a bunch of microphones in his face. And do you think it's too far to call it like a Mao-like struggle session, or do you think that really is what it is right now, or at least a version of it, and perhaps it could grow into that later down the line?
Oh, I think it's for sure a version of it, because if you just look at leftism generally, whether it be Marxism, communism, socialism, it's all the same play where you use mob tactics to force people who aren't really necessarily on one side or the other, just force people into thinking one way through threats, or because you want to feel like you're on the compassionate side or the so-called right side of history. All of these different tactics are part of the same game, which is to force you into one way of thinking. If they want to use violence, they'll use violence. If they want to use threats, they'll use threats. If they want to use just the image of the other side as Nazis, they'll do that. And so I think it's all part of the same system. It's a very effective system. And unless we stand up to it, the same thing is going to happen here.
And when we talk about these safe spaces, remember that's been one of the buzzwords for many years now, but a lot of this left-wing talk, a lot of this browbeating has created safe spaces for bad people to percolate and to have somewhere where they can, be safe, I guess, to be criminals. And of course, in my mind, I'm thinking right now that story we just talked about from the UK, and this woman, she says her father who sexually abused her, molested her, raped her for years, and he had no indications of any gender dysphoria, at least from what it appears to be, is that, hey, I could have an easier time being a woman and, being trans at that. And it seems like he took that safe space to say, hey, I'm kind of beyond reproach at this point. Do you think that that's what we're seeing more and more, that criminals who aren't trans themselves, they don't actually have gender dysphoria, but what they're seeing is this is a safe avenue for me to, I guess, to hide and to almost be enthroned as a victim now in the status hierarchy we have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why wouldn't they? You've got people who are breaking the law. That's the premise here. And so they're not exactly playing by the same rules as the rest of us. I think people are always going to look for an easy way to achieve what they want. And so people are going to be the victims of that. On the other side, ultimately, and often that's women. When we're really, really talking about the truth of this, we're talking about vulnerable women. Men who want to attack these women will find any way they can. We've got cases in California where men are being placed in women's prisons simply because they identify as women. And guess what? Women are being raped. That's the brutal reality of what's happening here. We can, chew gum and walk at the same time, as people on the left love to say. We can talk about actually addressing people who actually have gender dysphoria. We can talk about their role in society and what can be done to actually help the suffering they're going through, while also admitting that there are people who are going to take advantage of this, going to make up the idea that they believe they're one thing or another simply because they want to get what they want. There are always going to be people who take advantage of the system. We see it in every part of our life. And I think the fact that the left are ignoring this shows how really not compassionate they are.
And also because it's an unreproachable group. When someone says it's my identity, you can't say anything back unless you're a conservative. Then the left, then they don't believe you. If I want to say I'm a man or whatever, they're going to say, yeah, right, sure. But if I was, actually a man and I was a criminal sex offender, I could say I'm a woman. And now because of their own ideology, they can't say anything against me. They can't question me on it. And I hate to pit men versus women because feminists have done that for far too long. But I guess to put it into their own terms, what these reactionary, or what these feminists, I should say, are creating is an untouchable class of men where you as a woman cannot say anything about them, whether or not they're in your bathrooms or in your places for shelters for, as you said, women who are survivors of domestic violence, whatever it may be. These men can now go into those spaces and you can't question their identity. But wrapping it up before I let you go tonight, it's kind of funny, you have to admit. The study that came out that the Post-Millennial was reporting on about narcissism and other dark, toxic traits associated with leftism. Do you think that that's exactly what we're seeing on display right now?
Yeah, obviously. I mean, when you've got people screaming about their right to do this, that, and the other, when there are no rights that exist along those lines, it's obvious that narcissism is at the root of this. It's at the root of being entitled to something you haven't earned. It's really at the center of leftism, the idea that you are more important than the person next to you. You deserve things you haven't earned. You deserve things that someone else has earned. Of course, narcissism is at the root of this, and I think people play to narcissism because it's one of the easiest things to pander to. So it doesn't surprise me at all. I think, again, as you noticed, though, it's not going to be the kind of science they like, so I'm sure they'll throw that in the shredder as quick as they can.
What happens? Science says, reports say. That's what we've been hearing for so long. But Ian, it's always a pleasure having you on. Thanks for dropping by tonight.
Thanks for having me.